Welcome to a discussion on the control of nuisance animals in the garden and landscape. My name is Phil Radebush. I'm an Extension Master Gardener volunteer in Buncombe County, North Carolina, a retired veterinarian, and a certified Blue Ridge naturalist through the North Carolina Arboretum. I enjoy talking about nuisance animals in the garden because of my background and long-term interest in gardening, veterinary medicine, and natural history. In this presentation, we'll focus on small mammals, which I've arbitrarily categorized as mammals that have an adult body weight of 5 pounds or less. This presentation is part of a series of 9 gardening videos on nuisance animals that also includes information on the other topics listed here. If you're having problems with a specific type of animal, you may want to watch one or more of these other videos. This includes videos on planting deer-resistant landscapes and repellents. All these videos can be found on the Buncombe County Master Gardener website, which is buncombe-mastergardener.org. So let's get started. In this presentation, we're going to focus on bats, mice, chipmunks, and squirrels. We're not going to talk about voles and moles, although those also fit the category of small mammals. And that's because there is a separate video that specifically talks about voles and moles. And that's because they are commonly misidentified for each other because they have very similar common names, and they also can look a little bit similar in physical appearance. So if you're interested in information on voles and moles, please see the other video. There are 17 species of bats that are found in North Carolina. The big brown bat, pictured here, is very common and it's most abundant in deciduous forest areas and in suburban areas of mixed agricultural use. Common maternity roosts are found in buildings, barns, bridges, and of course in bat houses. Like all insect-eating bats, big brown bats are a vital part of a healthy environment, and they're key players in the checks and balances of insect pests. Reproductive female bats, those female bats that are nursing young in the roost, can consume their body weight in insects each night. However, bats can be vectors of rabies, and they should always be handled very carefully to prevent being bitten. Consult licensed animal control companies about removal of unwanted bat colonies in buildings. I've had a personal experience with bats in my home. I live in a townhome in western North Carolina. We noticed several years ago that in the evening, about dusk, about sunset, about 15 or 20 bats would fly out from under the eaves of our townhome. And then in the morning, right before sunrise, the bats would return to our home. We knew they were a vital part of the environment. They were probably helping to control mosquito and other insect populations in our yard and in the neighborhood, so didn't think much about it. They were in the soffits. Their roost was in the soffits of the house and weren't inside the attic or inside the house itself. But when the guano began dripping out of the colony through the soffits and onto our deck, we knew it was probably time to go ahead and control them. They turned out in the end to be big brown bats. But it's important to note that about half of the species in North Carolina are considered by the federal government and the state to be endangered, threatened, or species of special concern. So you just can't indiscriminately get rid of the bats. They are also a protected migratory species. So in this case, we used a certified animal control company to remove the bat colony in the fall after the bats had migrated and left the roost, and to close up the openings that allowed them to get into the soffits. But I'm going to go ahead and put on my hat as a veterinarian and talk a little bit about rabies in North Carolina, where I live. And I went back and looked at the data over a 4-year period of the positive rabies cases that have been identified in North Carolina. Every year, the incidence of rabies by a species is published for each of the states. So I just looked specifically at North Carolina for the period, the most recent data from 2016 to 2019. And you can see in that period of time, the animal most commonly positive for rabies was the raccoon. And that's true for most of the states along the eastern seaboard. The two next most common species were skunks, both the striped and spotted skunk, and foxes, both the gray and red fox. But you can see in that 4-year period of time, there were almost 100 bats that were positive for rabies. Among domestic animals, the most commonly positive animals are domestic cats, and that's probably because there are a number of feral cats or cats that spend a lot of time outdoors that come in contact with wildlife species, and because people are less likely to have their cats vaccinated against rabies than dogs. So next we'll talk about chipmunks and mice. So they are all omnivores that have a very high metabolic activity. So they feed aggressively with a wide variety of plant material. They will also eat insects and earthworms and slugs and snails and other invertebrates. They're seldom eliminated, but oftentimes we need to try to control their populations. Mice are omnivores, and the three most common mice that we have in western North Carolina are the white-footed or wood mouse, the eastern harvest mouse, and the deer mouse. They rarely damage plants, and so their problem is more of a nuisance in that they will burrow and then sometimes set up nests in sheds and that type of thing, and may cause damage by eating seeds. But oftentimes mice are confused with voles. Voles can really be a problem. They're small mammals that commonly are mistaken for mice. They live in fields, orchards, meadows, and shrubby habitats. Vole problems are really increasing as we incorporate natural areas into our landscapes. Voles are herbivores and they feed on plant roots, bulbs, and corms, and can gnaw on tree stems and roots because they like to eat the growing tissue or cambium underneath the bark. The two most common voles are the woodland or pine vole, which is pictured above, and then the meadow vole, which is pictured below. And the meadow vole is sometimes misidentified as a mouse and called a field mouse. So if you see a mouse-like animal where you're having damage directly to growing plants, it's more likely to be a vole than a mouse, even though they can look very similar. If you're having that kind of problem, I would encourage you to watch the video on voles and moles for better ideas about managing voles. Chipmunks are a nuisance primarily from their habit of digging for food and excavating burrows and surface runways. They have, again, very high metabolic activity, so they may eat their weight in food every day. Again, there's a picture of some of the burrows that can occur, and this can also occur around the foundation of houses and under decks where it can be a big nuisance. Chipmunks, instead of mice, will consume vegetative matter, living vegetative matter, so they'll eat flowers, they'll eat bulbs, they may occasionally eat materials in the vegetable garden as well. I had a friend who had a group of chipmunks he knew were living under his deck, and he was planting bulbs and doing other gardening in the fall one year. And after a couple hours, he looked up, and the bulbs that he'd been planting, a chipmunk had dug them up and placed them right along the rock wall along his home. So he was very discouraged from that activity. Control of chipmunks can be done with traps, either snap traps like you would use for rats or mice, also poison bait stations. You can live trap chipmunks as well using peanut butter and impregnated with bird feed as a attractant. Again, they can oftentimes be controlled, but very often can't be eliminated. There are 4 squirrels that occur commonly in western North Carolina: the gray squirrel, the fox squirrel, the red or pine squirrel, and the southern flying squirrel. And the gray and flying squirrels usually cause the most problems in the garden or landscape. The gray squirrel is mostly diurnal, so you'll see it most active at dawn and dusk, although certainly you can see it throughout the day. The flying squirrel is nocturnal, so if you're having squirrel damage or problems that you're finding first thing in the morning that occurred overnight, it's more likely to be a flying squirrel. It's important to note that the gray squirrel is the North Carolina state mammal. Squirrels will eat a variety of material. They will eat fruit, seeds, nuts, buds, bulbs, shoots, insects, conifer cones, even mushrooms. And they may damage trees by debarking them. Again, they like the cambium layer that's right beneath the tree bark. They will also cut an excessive number of buds. In the late winter and early spring, they often destroy growing tips of young trees and shrubs. Sometimes you can tell the origin of depredation by how they consume something like sweet corn. Gray squirrels will bite the kernel from the cob and only eat the germ, while fox squirrels will move the entire cob to a feeding perch. Of course, for those of us who have bird feeders, we know that squirrels are a big nuisance around bird feeders. So how can we manage a squirrel situation? Well, one thing is to learn to live with the squirrel. I have a friend who just loves to feed squirrels at her home. They have their vegetable garden, and most of their landscaping is in the back of their house. And in the front of their house are large shade trees where the squirrels nest. She has basically set up a squirrel feeding station with primarily shelled corn. Squirrels like to come to that and eat the corn on a regular basis and leave the garden and the other plantings in the yard alone. For those of us that feed birds, we can invest in squirrel-proof bird feeders as shown on the right, or we put out things like suet. We can put out suet or food that has been laced with hot pepper or capsaicin. Birds cannot taste capsaicin, but squirrels, like other mammals, will find it unattractive. What I've done is to put a 2-foot wide sheet metal band around high value trees or around posts on the deck to keep the squirrels from climbing. You can also use poultry wire under and over bulb plantings, which will allow the plant to come up through there, but will prevent the squirrel from getting to the bulbs. Then finally, are legal hunting seasons on squirrels, and that may help when you have a high squirrel population. So that's a discussion about mice and mice versus voles, chipmunks, bats, and squirrels. Hopefully you found a few tips about how you might deal with these nuisance animals in your garden or your landscape. If you need additional help or have additional questions, you can contact the in Buncombe County Garden Helpline, which is available by phone or in person during the growing season from March through October, or you can submit your questions via email to buncomemg@gmail.com. And that's a good way to do it because you can not only ask your question, but you can submit pictures of pests or plants or plant diseases or problems along with your email. Thanks for joining me, and happy gardening.